Welcome to the podcast, Dr Neryl East.
Hello, Lisa. It's wonderful to be here, and hello to everybody listening.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to a deep dive into your topic of expertise, credible communications in spotlight situations. Fascinating topic, and of course, one that leaders have got to get right if they want to have that credibility among their team and among the broader community. So before we dive into the topic at any length, can you share in 60 seconds your entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah, 60 seconds, life flashing before our eyes. So I started out as a journalist. I worked in television and radio for many years. Then I crossed to the dark side into corporate communication. So I worked for various organisations, all tiers of government, but corporate sector as well. And realising that most of them don't really have a clue when it comes to negative issues and crises. And then for about the last 12 years, I've had my own business where I work with leaders, helping them communicate well in what I call spotlight situations, when the pressure's on, the stakes are high, and the outcome really matters.
Excellent summary there, Neryl. I can tell you're used to the 60 seconds. That's awesome. So before we dive in, just give us an example of what a spotlight situation might be.
Well, interestingly, the name suggests it's when a leader, is standing up on a big stage in front of an audience or in the media, and it certainly does relate to that. And it could also equally be you as a leader having to have a really difficult conversation with an individual team member or with your team as a whole, or taking part in a meeting with a client where the stakes are particularly high. So spotlight isn't necessarily literally a spotlight. It's
Yeah.
a situation when you're under pressure. And I'd suggest that there's never been a more important time for every leader to be able to communicate with credibility during those times. People don't know who to trust anymore, particularly after the last 2 years. They don't trust government. They don't trust any form of media. They're actually looking to their employer now. They're actually looking to the institution they work within, whether that's in mining or any other sector, and looking to the leaders in that organisation to be that trusted source of truth. That's a huge responsibility for leaders. Also a great opportunity. So, I wonder for the leaders listening, what are you doing to make sure that you're ready now? You're leveling up your skills in that area.
Yeah, and that's a key component. Are you ready now? Because when these issues happen, they tend to happen fast. And as we know, no communication is not good. Leaders have got to be able to step up sooner rather than later and deliver that clear and concise message with authority, but also with authenticity. So, in your opinion, Neryl, where do many leaders go wrong? What can go wrong when we're under the pressure and we've got these spotlight situations to deal with?
Yeah, great question. And you've already touched on part of it, Lisa. Often they wait. They think, let's just wait and see. Or the classic, let's wait and see if this gets out. Hello, in the social media age, it's always going to get out.
Yeah.
You have to assume that. And so leaders need to communicate early, even if you don't have all the facts, even if you don't want to be seen to be accepting responsibility. Because, there's no shortage of information anywhere these days. People have information about whatever's going on in your organisation. Whether it's true is something entirely different. So if you're waiting to communicate, people are already communicating about it, but they will have the wrong end of the stick. So you need to be in there as the source of truth. And it's warts and all communication. It used to be, spin rule. I've got a PhD in journalism. I can say I'm a bona fide spin doctor. But those days are over. People can see inside your organisation like they've never been able to do before. So we need to be honest and transparent. So it's not about sugarcoating if something's gone wrong. It's about communicating early, communicating frankly with truth so that you're building trust. That doesn't happen very often. The leaders that do that reap the rewards, but often we find, that isn't the case, and organisations pay a big price for that.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that there's a huge team behind this. It would be the comms team and the broader leader. So the person who's at the front delivering the message may not necessarily be pulling all the strings.
In larger organizations, you're
Yeah.
absolutely right. It's going to be a team effort, but it starts at the top. And
Mm.
often, I work with a lot of communication professionals who are, wonderfully skilled, and yet their advice isn't listened to. Sometimes they're quite low
Yeah.
down in the organizational structure, and it's the CEO, the C-suite who have the influence at those critical times. They're not following advice. So if you're a leader and you've got comms professionals, please listen to them because they know what they're talking about. It can be intimidating to be the one stepping out in that
Yeah.
spotlight, either literally or figuratively. However, it's so important for your organization that you're doing that proactively, clearly, and in a way that connects with the audience.
Yeah. So in this instance, the spotlight is not that wonderful place where we're showcasing our skills and our brands and our products. This is the spotlight that nobody really looks forward to in their career, and yet at some time, all leaders will probably have to do this. So preparation mentally would be super important. What are some tips that you can share around the preparation for delivering a message of this sort?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, spotlights can be positive as well. I don't want to say that all of these are defending a negative position. It can also be how do you make sure that you're really nailing it when you've got a positive message. But in terms of preparation, for the issue itself, if it's a negative one, the preparation starts long before.
Yeah.
Usually it even becomes public, which is, I guess, a whole separate topic. For the leader themselves, it's really interesting, Lisa, and I'm sure you know this too in your work in communication, that most leaders, even very senior leaders, still have all the same doubts and insecurities as the rest of us. They have imposter syndrome. They have the critical voice, whispering in their ear. What are you talking about? People will be doubting you. All of that. But in my experience, the ones who are really able to nail their message have been able to work through that. They still have those feelings. They're no different to you and I. But in that moment, they're able to put everything else aside so that they can 100% focus on what's in front of them. And so for those of you listening, what do you already do that you could bring into those situations? You might be a person who likes to meditate, or you do deep breathing, or you do power poses, or you just spend 30 seconds just being in silence. Sometimes I do a little mind trick where I visualize an airport trolley filled with luggage, because on the East Coast, it's been a while since we've actually seen one of those for real. And I imagine that that's all my baggage that I'm bringing into the situation, whether it's a difficult conversation or a presentation. And I just leave that mentally at the door. Might be a virtual door or an actual door. I'm just like, you can stay outside this room because I need to be here and present. Also things like making sure that you are breathing properly in that pressure situation. Sounds kind of obvious, breathe, but taking deep abdominal breaths so you're not breathing up in your chest. Things like that, I work with leaders to practice, which then in turn fuels their confidence in the moment, so that now they can really focus on their message and connecting with whoever's in front of them.
Yeah, one of the things that I help leaders do when I'm teaching executive presence is that's intention setting. So that's also part of that, breath work, preparation, mindset, but having that intention where you go in and, the intention I would imagine in some of these situations is to be authentic, to be clear, to get the message across in the most clear way, in a transparent way as well.
Yes, absolutely. So I love that around intention setting. So it's always thinking about what's the outcome that I want to walk away with, and ideally an intention that benefits all parties. It's not just an intention of you going in wanting to have a win. People can sniff that a mile away, and that damages credibility. So having that broader intention, but also I do a lot of work with leaders around really thinking about their audience, and by audience again that might be a conversation, so the other person in the conversation, and it's really framing everything you do through the other person's eyes as much as possible. Not that you're going to pander to them or give them what, it's not about that, but it's really thinking about what's going on for that person or those people. How are they going to be framing my message based on where they're at right now? What sort of examples and stories can I tell that is going to bring my message to life for them? a lot of leaders go in, not just in spotlight situations, but in general, and communication is a pushing out motion. I've got something important to say, and whoop, blah, there it is. And then they, job done, I've communicated, and they walk away. But of course, that's not the case at all. And I liken that to kind of, being in a gym where you see those machines, that the weights that people push across the floor. Yeah. It's a bit like that. Whereas the sort of communication that I help leaders with, and I'm sure you do as well, it's audience first, connect first, then think about your state, and now finally think about your actual message. It's actually the reverse of what many people do.
Yeah, awesome. Loving this conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, Neryl. And I'm so glad that you brought up empathy. I had a wonderful chat last week with Daniel Murray on the podcast about leading with empathy. And it's so critical these days, because as you say, people have got a very tuned in BS radar, and they will see through that. And that's a sure way to lose credibility. Yes. Neryl, what about when a leader shares some communication, and then they realize that they need to go back and perhaps apologize? Perhaps they realize that the communication that they've shared has been damaging in some way to a particular group, and they need to put that right.
And again, the principle is the same. It's communicating early. So as soon as you realize, if you've made a mistake, whether it's something that you said or something that your organization has done, you need to communicate early, not when you're forced to communicate. I think that's the biggest credibility killer, where people apologize, leaders apologize, but it's pretty obvious to everybody listening and watching that they've already been caught out. The story's already out there. Yeah. There's a huge, a huge credibility boost if you actually communicate, even if you're risking your reputation by doing so. Yeah. That you're standing up there with courage and talking about what's happened. People will respond better to that than if you wait until you're forced to apologise. And of course, the apology has to be genuine. No. Often what we see is leaders apologise, but the behaviour doesn't change. Nothing changes within that organisation. The apology has to be heartfelt, and it has to mean that something changes. Something is done differently. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself apologising again 6 months later. And that cumulative effect of public stuff-ups is what really leads to long-term reputation damage. If your reputation's already on the nose and something else goes wrong, people are going to, perceive you very, very harshly, and it's going to take you a long time to come back from that. If you've got a track record of managing negative issues well, there's a forgivability factor that can come into play. Always depends on what's gone wrong, the scale of it, and all those things, but it is possible to actually emerge in an even better position if you manage it well.
When you were describing that, Neryl, I had a particular political leader, Australian political leader, who came into mind, who has to apologise quite often for their communication. But there's always a bit of a very subtle but a definite smirk on the face. And of course, people see through that. You may be apologising sincerely, but if the body language doesn't match, then people are not going to buy into that. Would you agree?
Oh, look, 100%. And you've got to buy the message you're selling. Yeah. And so if you're disingenuous about that, if you're only apologising because one of your political minders or your comms manager has told you to, but you don't buy it, you're actually better off not saying anything. Because you're right, Lisa, people can interpret that. And your body language is going to be working against you, because every part of your physiology is going to be, denying the words that are coming out of your mouth. And so I'd really be careful in those situations, and maybe somebody else needs to do the talking in those situations. So apologise early, but make it heartfelt. Being, less than authentic is very, very damaging.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you for sharing. So, Neryl, can you share some practical tips that leaders who are listening can use when they've got to next prepare for a difficult communication?
Yeah, and look, a lot of this actually stems, way back before the communication. Yeah. Often people will call me in when they're in crisis and expect me to wave a magic wand and fix what's happened. Yeah. And I would say in the vast majority of cases, the situation was completely avoidable if only they'd taken action 6 months earlier or a year earlier, and I can track that back. So first of all, I'd say even before you feel you need to step up and communicate in a spotlight situation, what mechanisms do you have in place to just monitor what's going on in your environment inside the business and in the environment outside that might give rise to negative perceptions or issues about your organisation? And there'll be obvious ones to you depending on your sector, if it's mining or whatever. So start to heighten your awareness about those and be proactive. It's like weeds in a garden. If you ignore the weed, particularly with the amount of weather we're having on the East Coast, they're going to rapidly grow. So think of your organisation like that and see if you can zap those weeds when they appear. That will cut down your need for spotlight situations. But in terms of going in, it's really the order that I said before. So first of all, really think about who else is involved, what you know about them. If you're in a large organisation, you've got to communicate, or perhaps you do need to communicate publicly, I really encourage you to think about who is your ideal audience. Who do you really need to get that message to? It might be to the public at large, but there's probably one group that are at the forefront of that. It might be your own staff or prospective customers, whoever it is, and get a visual of a person like that and have a conversation just with them. That's going to really elevate your level of connection, even if you're communicating into a camera lens. So that's the first thing. Then it's looking at your personal state, your level of comfort in the moment. What practical things can you do to get yourself in as calm a state as possible so that you can focus 100% on whatever's in front of you in that piece of communication. And then thirdly, thinking about your content. And there's all sorts of structures and frameworks we could talk about. I won't go into all of that now, depending if it's an apology or it's proactive communication or whatever it is. Most leaders think about their content first. What have I got to say, and spray it out? The audience, then yourself, then your message, and that's going to be setting you up for a much better outcome.
Excellent tips. That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing, Nell. What about the importance of the debrief process? So the leader has gone through those steps and they've stepped off the platform or the spotlight having delivered this message. What kind of debrief process would you recommend?
Well, learning lessons from any experience is very, very powerful, isn't it? And, it's so easy to just get caught up in the next thing, to not even think about what worked well there. So I'd always encourage, if it's a public communication situation, sit down with your comms team or whoever you have in that space and have a conversation about, what did we do well? How did that message land? What evidence do we have that people took our message, absorbed it, believed it, understood it, and acted on it? What might we do next time? Are there skills we need to build up? Or it might simply be a high stakes conversation, and that might just be a more personal reflection, just thinking about how that conversation went. You might check in with the other person, or it might just be something that you do internally. But, I learn something new every day in this space. And I think as leaders, we can all benefit from, sharpening our reflective skills, so that we're building those skills rather than just making the same mistakes over and over again, which unfortunately we do see.
Yeah. And I think that, do you think it would be fair to say that if you're working in a large organization, that it's not if, it's when you will have to deliver one of these messages? So like you say, sharpening the skills, we learn, we brush up on our safety each year, and we do our annual competencies. Why not make this part of your L&D or your leadership development so that people feel more prepared when they've got to suddenly step up and do that timely communication?
Absolutely. And what I find is if people will prepare for a presentation, if I were to say to leaders listening, you've got to do a half-hour presentation at a conference, you'd prepare for that. But we don't tend to afford the same respect to important conversations when in fact the stakes might be even higher. The impact of that conversation might be, very significant. So I really encourage you, do your preparation and rehearse, even with conversations, rehearse out loud. Yes, obviously conversations aren't just one way. You can rehearse your side of things.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that's how it's going to play out necessarily, but even going through that process means you won't be reaching for the right messages when you're in the moment. You'll be able to focus on engaging with the person and interacting and really getting a sense of where they're at. And it's not about being glib and polished, it's being prepared so that then you can be a better leader and a better communicator in that moment by embodying your message.
And I think when you spend that time in the preparation phase, that's the time when you can really think about the empathy, think about how potentially that message is going to land with the person or people that you're speaking with. Because often, when all sorts come into our mind when we are in the moment and we're under that pressure, sometimes that can be pushed to the back when we're dealing with our physiological response.
Yep, totally. And the magic is, and I'm sure you know this, Lisa, when we focus on the other person or the audience, it's actually not possible. It's not physically possible to be self-conscious because we're other person conscious. It's not, I don't mean that we're thinking about them and worrying what they're thinking about us. That's not it. But we're thinking about them and what do they need from me in this moment? What value can I bring? Is there something that I can clarify for them in this moment? And now it's not possible to be thinking about, I stumbled over a word, or I said or should I have worn this particular shirt, or what, all the other, crazy stuff that goes on in our minds when we get self-conscious, which is just that inner voice trying to protect us. But in fact, we don't need protecting. If we can put our focus out on the other person and on our intention, that's where the real power lies. I mean, leaders come to me a lot and say, can you make me more confident? It's like, we can plaster confidence on the outside, but confidence, of course, is an inside job. And the leaders who recognize that and do that inner work are the ones who are really able to shine in those spotlight situations when they're needed most, when your teams are looking to you at this time of great uncertainty, looking to you to help join the dots. The leaders that do that inner work are really able to give that tremendous value to those they're communicating with.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Now, can you share a case study or an example of some crisis comms done well?
Yeah, for sure. So a good example for me is the Chief of the Defence Force, General Angus Campbell. Those listening might be aware in 2020, he had to step up and deliver the findings of the Afghanistan report, which was the report that talked about, alleged war crimes by some of our most elite SAS personnel. So by any measure, that was very, very bad and difficult news to have to deliver, to kind of step up and say, some of our most revered personnel did, allegedly very, very bad things. And what I loved about the way General Campbell delivered that message was he was completely authentic. There was no ducking and weaving. There was no deflecting. And I think perhaps the media expected that he would deflect and, try to not take responsibility. But he just very calmly stood up and took full responsibility for what happened. This happened. We are genuinely sorry for what happened, and then laid out a plan for what was going to happen next. And he did it without defensiveness. He was able to take questions very, very graciously. And what was fascinating was that even though the report itself was shocking, and I'm sure those listening who saw and heard that would agree, even hard-nosed journalists, from the Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald, the ABC, used words to describe his delivery. They described him as dignified, compelling, credible. And I thought that that's one of the very few times in Australia that I'm aware of that we haven't shot the messenger when bad news has been delivered, because he was able to deliver that so compellingly. And so I think that's a great example. That was live streamed. Anybody listening can go back and check that out and just have a look and see if you agree that message was just delivered so eloquently, so that we could hear the information rather than being distracted by the person delivering the message. And that's really what it's all about.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that example, Neryl. That's a good one. And have you got an example to share of comms not done as well?
You don't have to look too far, do you, for that? And I think everybody listening can probably
Yeah.
cite some examples. And I know that it's very state specific, everything that's happened over the last
Yeah.
few years. But I started off at the start of the pandemic feeling a lot of, empathy for our political leaders of all
Yeah.
persuasions. This is not political, thinking,
Yeah.
wow, imagine having to be in that situation, and they're doing the best they can. But, as it's gone on, now I'm looking, thinking, what on earth is going on? Just the
Yeah.
conflicting messaging, and we just seem to have lost the plot. And as a result of that, the research shows that trust in government, no surprises, in Australia has fallen more than in any other country,
Yeah.
which is, I wonder what the long-term toll of that is going to be, because regardless of what political party you support or which
Yeah.
leader you like, I don't think it's necessarily a healthy situation to have a population now that just says, I don't trust anything the government says. I think it's going to take a long time to rebuild that. We haven't been in this situation before. How could we have done it better? I think, books are going to be written about this for years to come.
Yeah.
But I just think in terms of confusion of messaging, they've really set new heights.
Yeah,
In
I
terms of that,
agree. I
unfortunately.
agree. Certainly wouldn't want to be in any of their shoes, but definitely I agree that it sort of started off reasonably well, but then it's like, hang on, yesterday this was the news. We've shifted the goalposts again.
Yes.
What's true and what's not true.
Yeah, yep, yep. And I think just not bringing people along on the journey. I know in the eastern states when things opened up, that's all well and good, but people were still in the paradigm of, COVID is really, really serious and da da da. But by the same token, they just hadn't brought people on the journey that actually things are a little bit different, and we can be a bit more calm about it. And that caused a lot of distress in the community. It'll be very fascinating to see how it plays out in different parts of Australia as different things unfold.
Yeah, and of course, when we're talking about communication, particularly in very large or even global organizations, it's more than one person standing up front live, face to face or on camera. There's all the other digital comms as well. And I remember reading about the Malaysian Airlines tragedy and how after the accident happened, they were still sending out emails of special offers and sending people general comms messages
Yes,
and maybe
yes.
not switching. Is it called the dark site where they've got the site that switches over in case of an
Right,
emergency?
yes, yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
and they
So
hadn't
this
done
is,
that early enough.
yeah.
So people are getting the, hey, here's a special offer, and they've been
Oh,
impacted by a tragedy.
cringeworthy, isn't it? And that's long-term planning.
Yeah.
That's lack of long-term planning. And so all those sorts of things need to be considered in your scenario planning. That if, X happens, what are what are some of the first things? I know one of my clients was a large radio network where something had gone badly wrong on
Yeah.
air. So the first thing we did, of course, take that personality has to be taken out of all the marketing material. That was just part of the steps that we'd set out, because we
Yeah.
had a plan. And now, depending on your sector, it might be very different. But this is about, the left and the right hand in your organisation talking to each other, which is why it needs that leadership oversight. It can't be something that just sits with the comms or the marketing
Yeah.
team or, whatever sorts of teams you have. It has to be a whole of business approach, because, yeah, and you're right, what a terrible blow to credibility, and how distasteful to have what would seem like very glib marketing messages going out in a tragedy.
Yeah, but of course it's all automated. And if you've got a large social media presence, it's very hard to pull back that information, particularly if you're expecting Facebook to help with taking down information. So I guess, yeah, being part of very robust scenario and risk planning is the key.
That's right. And then if that does happen, then being ready to genuinely apologise and explain why it happened, rather than just ignoring it and going on your merry way, which does happen, unfortunately.
Yes, yes. Neryl, is there anything else that we haven't already covered that you would like to add?
I think what I'd add, just for every leader listening, that it's never been more important for you to level up your skills in this space, and it will be different for everybody. There's a bit of a myth that lots of people are born naturally gifted communicators. That's not my experience. There might be a couple,
Mine too.
but most people, this is
Yeah.
learned behavior. These are learned skills, with courage, with keeping an open mind and being prepared to practice and rehearse. Any leader can become more confident and competent in high pressure situations, and it's an essential skill for everybody. And I just encourage you to think about that and think about where your areas of development might need to be over the next, say, 12 months.
Thank you so much, Neryl. Now, the last two questions that all my guests get to answer. Number one, can you share a quote or mantra that you live by, Neryl?
So many, so many. I think that one of my favorites is what you don't change, you choose. And I can't tell you who actually said that originally. I think it's been plagiarized and changed a little bit.
Yeah.
But I just think that's very powerful for any leader, and particularly so when you're, mining for issues. No pun intended for those of you from the mining sector. When you're, keeping your awareness out for issues that might be emerging in your organisation. Always reminding yourself, what I don't change here, I'm choosing this behaviour or this particular process that isn't working. So this is a great reminder to all of us to keep getting better, to keep learning and keep improving every day. I think that's probably top of a very long list of favourite quotes.
That's a great one to share. Thank you. And Neryl, a book that has had an impact on you that you recommend would be a great addition to any leader's bookshelf.
My favourite book would be The Speed of Trust by Stephen M.R. Covey. So Stephen M.R. Covey is the son of the Stephen Covey who wrote 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. But this is a fabulous book, very easy read, and he really breaks down trust into components and credibility, and the fact that every leader needs this balance of competence, knowing what you're doing and being seen to know what you're doing, and character, being relatable, having integrity, being able to connect with people. And you can look around you and see it is a balance. When you look at leaders, do they have a balance? Do they have the right balance, or are they all competence and no character, or are they all character and no competence, which makes them a bit of a lightweight? And if you think of a leader like Jacinda Ardern, because working with groups, I always ask who is a leader, that's a credible communicator. Her name comes up more than anybody else. And I reckon it's because she's really nailed that balance. She gets that balance right, and that's why she's recognised. I know in New Zealand she's politically on the nose now, but as a credible communicator, her name universally comes up a lot. And there's a good reason for that.
I also love that book, Speed of Trust. So another recommendation from me. It's an essential book for leaders around communication. Thank you so much, Neryl, for being my guest. How can people find out more about you?
Thank you, Lisa. It's been a pleasure. So my website is neryleast.com. It's like Cheryl with an N. I do get that a lot, neryleast.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn and all the other socials, but I hang out a lot on LinkedIn because I do like to work with senior leaders in that credibility space, and that's where they hang out as well. So connect with me. I'd love to see you there.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your work, Neryl. I think that every organisation needs Dr Neryl East on their team. It's been my absolute pleasure having you as a guest today.
Thanks, Lisa. Bye for now, and bye, everybody.